The history of our people isn't told in our history books that we have today.
I had to learn to adapt in order to survive.
I think a lot of it is language barrier.
They're treated as though they have this deep cultural knowledge.
Of course, every child that enters your classroom will be a unique individual.
Our ancestors, they didn't have pen and paper to write on. They learned orally.
I want to get my education, and I want to help the Native American people.
Support them and just let them know that they can do great things in life.
It's a critical part of our educational program to address the needs of Native American kids.
The New Buffalo is education.
When it comes to educating today's young people in South Dakota, both students and educators face many challenges. Due to cultural differences and socioeconomic conditions facing many in Native American communities, the challenges can be even greater. When looking at statewide data, the gap between all students and Native American students in South Dakota becomes apparent. In 2006, the graduation rate for all students in South Dakota was 94.64%, compared to a graduation rate of 67.47% of Native American students. Trend analysis for the State Test of Education process shows that all students proficient in math in South Dakota was 73%, compared to 42% of Native American students. The same trend analysis for all students proficient in reading was 83%, compared to 59% of Native American students. When looking at ACT scores, the statewide average composite score was 21.8, compared to an average composite score of 17.5 by Native American students. Historically, educating Native people has been an effort to change and assimilate, rather than to uplift and acknowledge the culture. The challenges that educators and Native people in South Dakota face have been around since the majority culture has taken on the role of educator.
Most of my education has been left brain, and nothing to help me connect on my Indian side. And some of them are helpful, but I had to learn to adapt in order to survive, in order to graduate. And so sometimes I have to turn off my Indian thinking and then put on another cap.
I think a lot of it is language barrier. You know, we don't have a good vocabulary in most cases. I think if we understand the teaching, it'd be a lot easier. Or if it's not presented as, this is the only way. But, here's something else you need to learn.
I grew up on the reservation until I was about 9, and we moved off to Lyman. I graduated from Lyman High School, border community between Lower Brule, Crow Creek, and the Rosebud Reservation there. And, I got to be honest, and I always am honest. I said, I kind of learned how not to be Indian in that community because I thought that's what I needed to do to survive. And that messed me up. That messes you up when you don't get a chance to understand who you are and you try to be somebody else because maybe this will be an easier road to try to fit in.
Everything that we got in public school does not include Indian images or life. So that sometimes you feel that maybe we don't exist because we don't exist in the teaching materials that are taught to us. We don't exist in the actual world in which we live in, that we go home to every night, and what's being taught.
Of course, every child that enters your classroom will be a unique individual, all of themselves.
There are a lot of Lakotas that don't have that cultural background to differentiate themselves culturally from non-Lakotas. That have the genetic background and the relations, but not the cultural background. And I think the assumption or the stereotype is that all Lakota kids have this deep cultural difference. So they come into classrooms and they're treated as though they have this deep cultural knowledge. And that is not the case.
The social atmosphere, the home lives that a lot of our kids come from, unfortunately, just aren't supportive of education, of them attending.
So when these kids come into these classrooms and the assumption is that they have this different cultural, not different, that they have this deep cultural information, teachers put a lot of pressure on those kids because they'll say, oh, Johnny, what is the origin stories of Lakotas? That kid is not going to come to class anymore, right? He doesn't know. And he doesn't want to say, I don't know.
Is there any kind of mannerisms that I should know, such as, the child might not be looking at the teacher directly in the face. And that, became a bit of an issue with us. I know in my generation, we did not look at adults in the face, and that was out of respect for all adults, not just for a teacher or a certain person, but for all adults. I've heard a couple of comments to that he's not interested in this, or he's being dishonest and won't look at me in the eye, or he just does not even want to be in here, So there, there's different little cultural differences that that need to be, observed and just kind of, dealt with. Not making a big issue out of it, but just kind of realizing that it's okay if this Lakota child doesn't look me in the face. It's because, he's respecting me and I respect him back for that.
And, if my dad hadn't been there and my mom to rip the covers back off and get me up some days, I'd love to sit here and say, yeah, I would have pulled myself up and gone to school and got the job done. But when you don't have that, and unfortunately for a lot of our kids right now, they don't have that. It's hard to, you choose not to attend, you can skip out, nobody at home has real high expectations of what you do or don't do. I really honestly think that's our biggest hurdle to overcome, and that's the toughest one. Folks will say, we can do all we can within these school walls to try to create an atmosphere and develop programs that kids are going to want to be a part of. But that's only half the picture. The other half is what goes on, when they leave us at 3:30, 4 o'clock in the afternoon until the next day, the next morning. And unfortunately, those hours for a lot of kids aren't structured. There aren't a lot of people at home some nights, to see what's going on. And when that isn't happening, a lot of unfortunate things happen.
Economic conditions, a lack of culturally relevant curriculum, language barriers, and trying to live in two different worlds can place a lot of pressure on Native American students. Listening to their thoughts and experiences can give insight into ways of improving their education.
Just to be more aware that, they might have different views from you, but, just try to just take it in and just understand where they're coming from, because they might just, be like, I don't know, stubborn or something and think only one way. You have to learn to work with them, learn to respect their ideas and their dreams and their wishes and help them be successful, and just let them know that that they're Native American, and they're fine with it. You still expect the same high expectations of a student as you would anyone else.
Our ancestors, they didn't have pen and paper to write on. They learned orally. So I would have presentations orally, have them okay, well, you guys can just listen today, and then the non-natives, they learned to write on paper, or in tab or a dash, whatever. They learned to write notes, or I'd switch it up. I would okay, well, we're gonna learn. Some days you're gonna do it orally, just listen to me. You're gonna absorb it in. Some days you're gonna take notes. That's one way of living in two worlds, is to understand each other, how to learn how they learned.
Let them know how the Native American children are, in good ways, not to discriminate them or anything. And then I would send my students to do one-on-one student teaching with them, so they can get an experience or a feeling of how it actually really is.
Actually go to the reservation schools and have an experience as far as maybe teaching, you know, for a day, maybe even just a day would be good to see the, you know, the environment that is there on the reservation. You know, some of the schools are obviously way underfunded. You know, they don't have access to, you know, all the things that other schools may have access to. And I think what that would do, obviously, is to help them and create an understanding on what they can do and what type of, you know, philosophy they can bring to that classroom and how they can adjust that to, you know, empower the youth that are in front of them.
Just stay in school and do your best, and in the end, it'll pay off, and maybe one day you'll be able to do something great, you know, with your life. You know, just stay in school, do the best you can.
I'll just encourage them to go to class, you know, do an attempt. If they're, you know, lazy, just don't procrastinate. I mean, I remember being in high school and I would procrastinate all the time. But one thing I went to class. I mean, yeah, I was kind of failing in some classes, but I went to class. I showed them that I was interested, and I showed them that I'm going to graduate. You know, that's one thing, that's one key, is to go to class.
Stay in there and be involved, and don't be crabby or like snotty or all the time. Make friends, and when you have friends there, then you'll be wanting to go every day and stay.
When I was an 8th grader, I really didn't know a lot about, you know, what took place, you know, and what brought us to reservations today, you know, and I think if we can provide that teaching, you know, when you know, the early settlers came through, you know, 30 to 60 million buffalo once roamed, you know, this area. And that's how we lived. You know, the buffalo was our relative. You know, everything came from the buffalo. And that was our lifestyle. And, you know, we lived in that way. You know, they say as you know, humans, we were the caretakers of our environment, of the land, you know. And we understood that. We were, you know, we weren't better than anyone else. We were all, you know, in a sense, important to our way of life. And, you know, obviously that when the big change took place was when we were placed on reservations. Our way of life was pretty much, you know, gone forever. And so we are still trying to figure ourselves out as 8th graders, you know, even up to seniors. Even today, and a lot of us are still trying to figure out, you know, who we are and what our place is today. And, you know, I think if we can, you know, provide that teaching and provide, you know, some history, you know, as to what events led up to what we are today, you know, we would all benefit from that. And that's what we need to do. We need to take those steps to put the history, you know, in our classrooms, to teach the history so that we can find out who we are today, so that we can use what we have in our teachings, you know, and in a sense, I think, you know, we're going to find a whole lot of, you know, our young generation having a lot more success at an early age versus taking a long time to finally figure out everything and why we are in our situation today.
Improving the educational needs of all students is a high priority. One example of a program currently working in South Dakota is the Reading First program.
Reading First is a No Child Left Behind program whose goal is to bring all children to the proficient level of reading in grades K through 3. So it's an early literacy program. It has several components to it. The first piece is that the schools that are involved in Reading First all use a core program. In South Dakota, those schools were allowed to choose which core program they wanted to use within their districts. The only criteria was that it had to be SBRR, or scientifically based reading research. Another piece to it is that the schools have a literacy coach who works with the teachers and the administrators in the implementation of the Reading First system, because it truly is a system. It has several components to it. The next piece of it is an assessment piece. It's critical that all students are screened in the fall, winter, and spring of the year, and all students, meaning all students, to see where they are at in their proficiency level. Those students who are identified at risk or strategic then are assessed more frequently, and classroom instruction is guided or determined by the results of those assessments. All kids that are involved in a 90-minute uninterrupted reading block, which means no recess, no milk breaks, it's uninterrupted instruction. And those kids who are at risk or strategic receive some additional time with reading instruction outside of that 90-minute block. Statewide data is extremely exciting. In 2004, we had 16% of our kindergartners who were at risk for reading failure. This past spring, 2006, 1% of our kindergartners were at risk for reading failure. And that data holds really true in grades 1, 2, and 3 as well. We're seeing a significant decrease in those students who are at risk for reading failure. The data for all students in South Dakota parallels what's happening with our Native American students in those districts as well. We're seeing significant gains in those students who are reaching benchmark at all 4 grade levels, and in time we will have all kids reading at the proficiency level at the end of their grade, in grades K through 3.
Another program aimed at raising graduation rates and preparing students for higher education is the Gear Up program.
Gear Up stands for Gaining Early Awareness and Readiness for Undergraduate Programs, and it's really an effort to move low-income students from high school and middle school into higher education. And so here in South Dakota, Gear Up focuses on working with Native American students, predominantly from reservation schools. We serve 24 schools on 8 different reservations and then 1 school in Rapid City. So our student population we pull from is predominantly Native American, although all services are eligible to any students in any of the schools we work with. We start with students in the 7th grade, and we begin working with them after their 6th grade. So the first time we start with students is the summer before 7th grade. We offer an acceleration-based program, and these are held out on their reservations. And they'll have summer experiences for the rest of the 6 years that Gear Up is in existence. What we do is we target 490 students as our goal per year, and we'll work with that same cohort out of those 24 schools. But each year we'll add another group of 490 students. So over the 6 years we'll add 490 each successive year within our program. So, if we're able to replicate some of the results we've been having, we'll have over 1,500 students in our pipe bound for higher education. Some of the things that we do is we really start to have students think about what their goals are. It's hard for students to pick a path if they don't really have an endpoint. So we have them think a lot about goals and where they see themselves and what are some things that they've always wanted to do. Knowing that they may change their mind, but really the important thing is for them to pick a path. A lot of our students kind of wander aimlessly through middle and high school and really don't have a sense of purpose. What we do is we teach our students that you need to use your 4 years of high school effectively. Every class you take, every experience you do in a club, in a student council, it all counts. What we're trying to do is prepare our students not only for college entry, but also to be a fundable student. We do a lot of basically planning for scholarships, so we talk a lot about leadership development with our students, talk about volunteerism, get them to start thinking about how they can become involved in their communities, as well as how do each course contribute to their success of being able to get into college, but also get scholarships to go to college.
The state of South Dakota recognizes that with our student population consisting of about 12% of our students being Native American, it's a critical part of our educational program to address the needs of Native American kids. As a result of that, the governor has obviously initiated the Office of Indian Education. We've hired Keith Moore as our Indian Education Director.
We were just starting from ground zero, on what we were going to do in Indian Ed, how we could better work with tribal BIA, public schools, where the state could come in a capacity and generate some better scores academically and just help schools and communities to better serve Indian kids and to get some better data produced, what we were looking at when it came down to ACT, Dakota Step, and NAEP data. That would have been my big role when I started.
During the 2007 legislative session in Pierre, House Bill 1290 was introduced in the state capitol. Containing language that enhances Indian culture in our school system, the bill establishes an Office of Indian Education and creates an advisory panel consisting of representatives from all 9 tribes in the state.
We're going to discuss what we can do within our state standards and in our curriculum work within our state to infuse more Indian history, culture in our classes, with the idea, what I think is the most important part of this, to create a better picture between non-Indian folks and Indian folks in our state, to bridge a gap and to begin to see each other differently. I sure hope that our next generation of kids, Indian and non-Indian, can see a different picture within the state across fences in order to achieve academically and achieve the things that they want for their families. And I think that's what in the meat and potatoes of this bill really does, is give us a chance to start working with our younger kids and younger generations to make a difference of how we see each other and get rid of old stereotypes and old thinking across both fences. In our American Indian communities and in our non-Indian communities to better serve each other.
I too rise in support of House Bill 1290. Like Senator Garno stated, this is a start. And I want to thank the Office of Indian Education for allowing the Indian educators on the reservation to be part of this process, to listen to their concerns and their ideas. And I feel that this is going to be a good program to benefit everybody across the state of South Dakota. It will also benefit the Native American children who have lost our language, where they will learn to speak it once again.
On the 26th of March 2007, the bill was signed into law by Governor Mike Rounds, paving the way to a brighter future and bringing us ever closer to bridging the gap in Native American education.
This is the first step. Thank you.
Like the buffalo used to be for our people. The buffalo's gone, and the new buffalo is education. It can provide all that we need to make it in this world if we grasp on and take a hold and go along for the ride and apply ourselves.
I'd spend it on more cultural schools, set up not a whole bunch but few in the cities and on the res and stuff, where you learn the language, you learn how the old ways were, how you can apply them to, modern day, and you can learn about other cultures and things, Just set up schools like that so you'll have more Lakota speakers, more people who know about the history and people who know about how to do things, like how to set up a teepee or something, because most kids, they don't know how to do that. They don't know how to do anything like that.
Community-wise, I'd build a building and have something about gangs, early teen pregnancy, some adult workshops where, the alcohol or, and different child abuse or just different stuff that would help them, overcome. Not to be negative about it, but that's what I would have, and have more adult parent and student or daughter, son relationships, how they can, a therapy kind of thing, just to better the people, sober them up, or whoever is on the red will just help them get better and become a better role model for the, not just for their family, but for all the Lakota people.
First, I'd probably come up with a plan of what I wanted to do with it, and most likely it'd probably be with education, to educate the youth and about Native American way. And
to have maybe more than one teacher in the classroom. You'll have maybe a teacher that specializes in one aspect, whether it be the Western thought, and then you also have another teacher over here that really understands Lakota culture and spirituality, and can combine those together to create that understanding, and they can work with the students a little better in that way.